The thing about a reputation built on light is that it burns just as easily as it shines. It doesn't shatter you don't hear it until it's already too late. That's how it started. The night Meghan Markle walked into the Ed Sullivan Theatre, smiling like a woman who believed the firestorm was behind her. She thought she'd already survived her reckoning. What she didn't know was that her reckoning hadn't even begun. The walls backstage were humming faintly, electrically, with the energy of a room about to become a battlefield. She was smoothing the sleeves of her navy blue blazer-like armor, pacing her breath like it was choreography. She knew how this went. Walk out, smile, be gracious, be eloquent, be in control, and above all, pivot. Always pivot, from scandal to service, from headlines to hope, from royalty to redemption. But what she didn't account for was a host who wasn't here to protect her. Stephen Colbert was a man known for dismantling arrogance with charm. He had disarmed presidents with punchlines, cornered tech moguls with smiles. He was polite, but never passive. And tonight, his questions weren't going to be kind. They were going to be surgical, and she was going to feel every slice. The audience didn't know. Not yet. They applauded like they always did, cheerful, compliant. They saw the Duchess, not the storm. She didn't stumble, she didn't flinch, she waved, she sat. She said all the right things. And for a while, it worked. The beginning was warm. She leaned into the safe spaces: literacy, advocacy, children. Words she had said 1,000 times before. Words that cushioned, comforted, distracted. She spoke about libraries and reading corners, and the glow in a child's eyes when they met a story that felt like home. And the audience followed, nodded, clapped, laughed in all the places they were supposed to. For a moment, it felt like she was back, in control, but control is a fragile thing. Stephen's smile didn't shift, but his eyes did. That flicker, the one that always came before the turn appeared. He leaned back, not to relax, to create space, to set the stage for impact. And when he spoke again, it was with a softness that didn't ask. It challenged financial discrepancies, consulting fees, documents, percentages, less than 30% reaching the children, administrative costs, travel, strategic messaging. That was the first crack. The audience didn't gasp. Not yet, but they stopped smiling. The applause from earlier became a memory, and Meghan's face just for a second tightened. It was fast, almost invisible, but not invisible enough. She recovered, pivoted, talked about transparency, about accounting firms, but her posture betrayed her. Like a woman trying to keep herself from running, Stephen didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her build the defense, and when she finished, he placed the next block carefully, like a trap, not a counterpoint. A single gala, $300,000 spent, $200,000 raised, a net loss, silence. The studio didn't erupt, collapsed into stillness. Even the camera crews seemed to pause, and Meghan, she blinked. Her mouth moved before her brain could decide what to say. And when the words came, they weren't strategic. She called it outdated, inaccurate. She said their work was ongoing, their strategy long-term. But no one in the room was breathing normally anymore. Everyone had the same question. Was this still an interview, or had it turned into something else? She accused him of ambush. He stayed calm, accused her of redirection. She snapped back. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, but it wasn't cold. It was clinical. He was dissecting her, slowly, publicly, and she was bleeding. Strategic messaging, $400,000 Archwell Communications, a company controlled by her and Harry, a foundation paying itself. Even Stephen's delivery had changed. It wasn't smug, it was methodical. Like a man laying out receipts at a tax audit. And the crowd, once so warm, had turned ghostly quiet. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was radiating. Meghan tried to fight back, called it offensive, said every dollar had purpose, said communications were part of mission, said visibility raised money. But none of it sounded like it used to. The conviction was still there, but the composure was gone. Her hands had curled into the armrests. Her breath came faster, and then he said it. The numbers don't lie. That's when she stood. Not carefully, not gracefully, forcefully. The chair rolled backward, colliding with the stage floor. A ripple of gasps swept the audience. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her voice rose not as a plea, but as a protest. She called it a trap, a smear, a hit piece, disguised as journalism. And Stephen, to his credit, or his cruelty, didn't flinch. He didn't yell, he simply replied with more numbers. More names, Charity Navigator, the Better Business Bureau. Carefully layered explanations began to collapse. She wasn't explaining anymore, she was defending. But the war she was fighting wasn't just on that stage. It was with the ghosts of every headline that had ever called her a liar. Every segment that questioned her motives, every whisper that wondered if the image didn't match the intent. She said she was building something sustainable. He asked if it was sustainable to lose $100,000 on an event meant to raise money. She said impact took time. He asked if it was ethical to spend millions before proving results. She tried to stand tall, but it wasn't height she needed. It was proof, and she didn't have it. Her voice cracked, then rose, then cracked again. She accused him of undermining her work, of twisting data, of turning the complexity of service into accusations. He stayed seated. He let her tower over him, let her burn herself out. Then asked again, "Can you show results? $4,000 per child." She tried to say it wasn't about math, that impact can't be quantified. About accountability. About trust, she shouted. He listened. She paced. He watched, she gestured to the crowd, pleaded with the room. Tried to reclaim the narrative, but no one clapped, not anymore. The woman who walked on stage had been a public figure with a cause. The woman standing now was unraveling, not because she was evil, not because she was lying, but because, for the first time in a long time, she was losing control of the story. And that, more than the questions, quieter, her words slower, she said the same things, but this time they landed differently. Because now, the audience had seen behind the curtain, the hurt, the fury, and maybe even the guilt. She said she was trying to help. He said this wasn't about intent, it was about impact. And suddenly, every justification started to sound like noise. She removed the mic. She stood again. But this time, there was no explosion, just silence. She walked off stage, and no one said a word, because what had just happened wasn't an interview. It was a collapse of image, of narrative, of certainty. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. Part 2 is where the fallout really begins. If you're invested in what just happened, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Meghan was ambushed, or did Stephen do what needed to be done? And hit subscribe, because the next chapter is where reputations go to war. They always say you should never bring emotion to a chess match, that it clouds your judgment, makes you forget which piece is which. But what they never tell you, lost, because the other side will. The other side always does, and they'll use it like a blade. And tonight, as Prince Harry sat stone still in the studio that was never supposed to become a battlefield, emotion was all he had left. The first blow had come fast. Too fast. Stuart didn't build up. He didn't. Toy he struck, and Harry, God help him, had flinched. Not physically, not at first, but that internal quake, the one only cameras could catch, had already sent its shockwave through the room. And now, they weren't even pretending this was an interview. Desk like a man who just smelled blood. Not smug, not smiling, just steady. Like he'd been waiting years for this moment, and had finally run out of patience. He just opened the folder. The folder, God. The goddamn folder. It had been sitting there the whole time, thick and unassuming, like any other late-night host's notes. But when he cracked it open again slowly, deliberately no longer looked like prep, it looked like evidence. And Harry knew that whatever came next, it was going to hurt. Let's pause here, because it's easy to forget, under all the lights and laughs and branded mugs, that late-night television still remembers its roots. And Stuart never forgot, and media hypocrisy. And now, he was doing what he'd always done, only this time. The target wasn't a senator or CEO, it was a man who'd once been called a prince. He'd brought up the Africa trip, the one Harry had filmed for the docu-series, the one filled with drone shots and sunlit smiles and softly narrated monologues about meaning and service. Stuart's tone was deceptively light, but the words cut deep. He asked about the crew, the budget, The fact that the trip had cost more than some African aid organizations' entire annual budgets. Harry blinked, took a breath, said it was about awareness. Awareness, John let that word hang in the air like smoke. Then asked, so you needed a Netflix camera crew to be aware of poverty? The audience didn't laugh. Not anymore. That wasn't what this was. This wasn't comedy. Just falter it died. He leaned forward to now, as if proximity could somehow shield him from the implications. He talked about intent, about shining a light, about breaking the cycle. Maybe part of him still thought good intentions were armor, but Stewart wasn't playing that game. He asked about the production company, who owned it, where the profits went, who negotiated the deal. And Harry, already cornered, said the quiet part out loud. The we, of course, being himself and Meghan. The air shifted again. A few people in the crowd inhaled sharply, audibly, because once you admit the business behind the message, the whole message starts to look like business, sounded like spin. Let's take a moment here, because if you're watching this unfold in real time, you'd be forgiven for feeling uncomfortable, for wishing the camera would cut to commercial, for wondering why this was happening here, on a talk show, instead of in a courtroom or a documentary or some polished PR-managed damage control segment. But that's the thing about reckoning. It never shows up where you expect it. It doesn't knock. It kicks down the door. Harry's hands were fidgeting now. He didn't realize it. Most people don't, but Stewart did. And he didn't stop. He pivoted to the security issue. The insistence on taxpayer protection while simultaneously rejecting taxpayer-funded scrutiny. He didn't phrase it cruelly. That was the genius. He framed it as a question, and Harry, he gave the worst answer a man in his position could give. He said it was about safety. The second he said it, you could almost feel the ripple move through the room. Safety. Another word that should land softly, but, in this context, felt weaponized. Because Stewart had the data, the comparisons, the statements Harry had made about being hunted, about fearing for his family, about needing security for doing public good, but he also had the invoices and the optics. You can't ask for protection from the system while monetizing your exit from it, and Stewart made sure the audience understood that Harry was sinking now. Not dramatically, not in a meltdown kind of way, but in the quieter, sadder way. A man sinks when he realizes he's not here to be understood. He's here to be judged, and worse. He walked into the courtroom thinking he was the judge. Midway through, someone backstage signaled the cut for break. Stewart waved it off. Didn't even look, because this was the show now. And he wasn't going to interrupt it for a commercial about luxury cars and streaming apps. And if you're watching this right now, hit subscribe, comment below, because what you're witnessing isn't just an interview. It's a collapse. A carefully constructed image meeting an immovable wall of consequence. And it only gets worse from here, because the next topic was the memoir. Again, but not the stories. Not the trauma. No. Stewart went for the structure, the publishing deal, the reported $20 million advance. The timing, the fact that the book dropped just weeks before the coronation. And when Harry said it wasn't calculated, Stewart's smile finally returned. The edits. The choice to include intimate family details. He quoted passages word for word from the book. Ones Harry had clearly forgotten, or maybe hoped would be forgotten. He brought up the frostbitten penis anecdote, the hallucinations, the mushrooms, that finally silenced the prince. Do you regret it? Harry stared at him, blinked, opened his mouth, closed it again, and said, no. But he wasn't convincing, because regret doesn't always announce itself with apologies. Sometimes it shows up in the tremble of a voice, the shift of a gaze, back again, but this time he didn't need to say anything. He'd already won, not because he'd humiliated Harry, but because he'd done what no interviewer had done before. He'd made Harry confront the cost, not in money, in image, in trust, in what gets lost when you sell your truth to the highest bidder and expect people to buy it back in sympathy. The show wasn't over, but the performance was. Harry looked off camera now, not defiantly, not pleadingly, just lost, like a man who'd wandered into the wrong room and couldn't find the door, because the truth is, you can walk away from the crown. You can walk away from the firm. You can walk away from your country, your family, even your past, but you can't walk away from the consequences. And tonight, under the blinding lights of a studio built for comedy, Prince Harry finally realized what every exile eventually learns, The house always wins. Asterisk, asterisk, they say. Dignity is the last thing a man loses before he breaks. But the truth is dignity goes first. It's the first casualty when you're fighting for your own narrative in a room that was never yours to begin with. And tonight, as Harry stared into a studio that had gone from curious to carnivorous, dignity was nowhere in sight. Only sweat, only breath. Only the echo of a name that once meant reverence, now dragged through the mud of half-truths and public cynicism. The applause that had greeted him felt like it happened in another lifetime. Jaw never raised, never rushed, never allowed tightened the screws with that same surgical calm. A hunter who didn't need to chase, just stand still and wait for the prey to bleed out. It had moved from the memoir to the motives, from what was said to why it was said. Every answer Harry gave was dissected with a smirk. Every sentence was a scaffold he built, only for John to yank out the bottom beam and watch the structure collapse. He tried again. Said he wasn't attacking. Anyone said he was telling his truth. Said the system he left behind was cruel, outdated, and weaponized against those who wouldn't fall in line. And maybe if he'd said it somewhere else, and another night, in another room, those words might have landed differently. But not here. Not when every claim had a counterclaim. Not when every noble intention came with a dollar sign. Not when the man sitting across from him had 20 years of experience, dismantling public figures who believed sincerity was enough. John asked why Harry had included intimate details about his brother's temper, his father's inadequacies, his stepmother's manipulation. He asked how those details helped anyone. How they moved the needle on social justice, or mental health, or anything Harry claimed to care about. Harry said the world needed to understand the full story. John leaned in, eyes like blades, and asked, or did the world just need to buy it? The audience flinched, and Harry blinked. The kind of blink that betrays more than fatigue, it betrays doubt. Because the hardest part of telling your truth isn't whether people believe you. It's what happens when you start questioning it too. He talked about freedom, about breaking generational cycles, about the cost of silence. But the more he spoke, the more the room seemed to recoil, not out of hostility, out of exhaustion, like they'd heard it before. Like sincerity was no longer a currency that held value in a market flooded with carefully branded trauma. John didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the weight of the facts do the shouting. He pulled up numbers, sales figures, streaming deals, production budgets, a memoir that earned millions. And then he asked the only question that mattered now. What part of this wasn't monetized? Harry's lips moved, but the words didn't land, not because they weren't honest, but because honesty had stopped being the point. This wasn't about truth anymore. It was about ownership, about narrative, about who gets to say what happened, and who gets to frame it for the world. The tension turned viscous. You could feel it in your teeth. Harry tried to steer the conversation back to causes, his charities, his advocacy, the work he and Meghan had done since leaving the monarchy. But the pivot came too late. John pressed again, this time about Archewell, its financial structure, its media partnerships, its overhead. The kind of scrutiny Harry thought he'd left behind in London, now resurrected under studio lights. You wanted to escape the institution, John said, but you built a new one, and you run it like a palace with PR, with secrecy, and with walls. The words hit harder than any tabloid headline. Because this wasn't an attack from the press. This was a critique from someone who, until tonight, had been seen as an ally, and Harry knew it. You could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the way his eyes no longer scanned the audience for support, only escape. But there was none. Because even escape requires clarity. And Harry, for all his passion, all his pain, couldn't answer the one thing John kept circling back to. Why the book? Why the Netflix deal? Why the interviews, the podcasts, the speaking engagements? Why now? And Harry, tired and raw, and visibly unraveling, said the quiet part out loud, because it's the only way they'd listen. The room didn't gasp, it didn't cheer, it just paused, as if taking a breath it didn't know it was holding. John didn't pounce, he let the silence hang, because that's what real confrontation is, not volume, not spectacle. Just the quiet, unbearable ache of a truth no one knows what to do with. And then he pivoted. He brought up Diana, softly, carefully, like laying a flower on a grave. He asked Harry if he thought she'd be proud of the path he'd chosen, if she'd recognize her own legacy in the empire of content and controversy he'd built, and Harry looked like a man who had been shot and couldn't find the wound. He said she'd want him to be happy, to be free, to protect his family. And maybe that was true. But it didn't answer the question, because being proud isn't about outcomes, it's about means. And what John was asking without saying it was whether Diana would recognize herself in a son who turned grief into a business plan. The mood shifted again, from combat to elegy, from debate to something much more dangerous, regret. And for a moment, Harry seemed like he might break. Not in anger, but in grief. That deep, howling kind of grief that doesn't scream it sinks, but just as quickly. The walls went back up. The media polish returned. He straightened his jacket, took a sip of water, and said he had nothing to apologize for. And maybe he believed that. Or maybe he just needed to believe it, because sometimes clinging to your truth is the only way to survive the ruins of your own story. The next segment should have been lighter. A pre-planned clip from a charity event, maybe a joke or two, but no one could pivot, not the producers, not the audience, not even John Dott, because some interviews don't end, they linger, they metastasize, and this one was no longer about Harry versus John. It had become something else, something bigger. It was a mirror for every person watching, for every institution listening, for every story told too loudly, too quickly, too often. This wasn't about royalty. It wasn't about media. It was about what happens when pain becomes product, and the product starts selling. And no one, not even the man selling it, knows how to stop. If you're still watching, don't forget to hit like and comment whose side. Are you on Prince Harry's fight for truth or Jon Stewart's pursuit of accountability? Your thoughts shape this story as much as theirs. Asterisk, asterisk. They say the worst silence isn't the one in the room. It's the one inside your own head. When you realize every story you told to justify your decisions doesn't hold up under someone else's gaze. By the time the commercial break ended, Harry was no longer the man who had walked onto that stage. His jacket sat unbuttoned, his collar curled at the edges, and the royal posture that once made him seem unshakable now looked like a man desperately holding himself together. Even the way he breathed had changed, shorter, sharper, like he was no longer sure oxygen was guaranteed. Across from him, Jon Stewart wasn't grinning anymore. Because somewhere between the facts and the fallout, even he had begun to understand that this wasn't about contradiction or hypocrisy or even betrayal. It was about erosion of trust, of image, of legacy. The kind of erosion you only notice when the walls start caving in. The producers had asked if they should cut it short. With a lighter note, maybe throw to a sketch. But neither man moved, and in a room full of signals, no one knew what to signal anymore. So they kept going. John asked the question that hung over the entire night like smoke. If you had the chance to do it differently, would you? Harry paused not too long. Of reflection, but the kind that exposes internal chaos. He looked down, then at the audience, then past the cameras, as if searching for a version of himself that could still answer that cleanly. He said he had no regrets, but his voice betrayed him, because no regrets doesn't sound like that. No regrets doesn't hesitate. It doesn't blink. It doesn't tremble on the third syllable like a man who just told himself a lie and heard it out loud for the first time. John leaned in, softer this time, asked if he ever felt like he had traded one institution for another, the monarchy for the media, the firm for the feed, the crown for content. Harry didn't answer. A long, brittle exhale that sounded like surrender. But surrender to what? The truth? The guilt? The machine? Even he didn't seem sure anymore. And then John brought up the emails. They weren't leaked. They weren't hacked. They were public records communications between Arkowell's team and several streaming executives outlining content strategy priorities for the Sussex brand. John read them slowly, one by one. Lines about audience retention, conflict-centered narratives, post-trauma identity arcs, buzzwords disguised as intentions. But Harry wasn't hearing strategy. He was hearing exposure. Because this wasn't about an interview anymore. It was appealing, a slow, brutal unraveling of the space between purpose and performance. He asked John where he got them. John didn't answer, didn't have to. Truth doesn't need permission when it walks in the front door. Harry, sat back, rubbed his face, then said something he hadn't said all night. "I don't know who I am anymore." And just like that, the room collapsed, not in sound, but in spirit. Because those words, those 7 words, landed harder than any accusation, any document, any quote. They stripped the armor, erased the PR, made him human again, but not in the way he wanted. He didn't mean to say it. You could tell by the way he flinched after, like he had said it in the privacy of his mind 100 times, but never aloud. Never where it could echo. John, to his credit, didn't pounce. He just sat back and let the silence do the work. The audience didn't clap, they didn't cough, they didn't even move. They were watching something no one had expected. A man unraveling. Live, not because of an ambush, but because of the truth he brought with him, hidden in his own words. Harry tried to recover, talked about healing, about growth, about redefining manhood, but every word was now stained. Not by scandal, but by the unbearable weight of performance. He said he didn't seek fame, that he never wanted to be a celebrity. John asked the obvious question. Then why sign with the world's largest streaming platform? Harry said it was for impact. John asked, impact for who? And the silence returned. Because impact, when measured in deals and downloads, stops being about change. It becomes reach. It becomes relevance. It becomes revenue. And Harry, whether realized it or not, had turned his own pain into currency, and the world had paid in clicks. John didn't mock him for it. He mourned it. There was a long pause before the next question, a kind of intermission that happens when even the interviewer realizes the interview has gone too far. That maybe, just maybe, they weren't exposing a fraud. They were witnessing a man who had built a house out of firewood and couldn't understand why everything kept burning. So John did something no one expected. He asked Harry what his children would think of all this. Harry froze, not like before, not the kind of freeze that comes from strategy or panic. This one was visceral, paternal, gut-deep. He said they'd understand one day, but again he didn't sound sure. John pressed, said, kids don't read intentions, they read headlines, they read tone, they read silence. And in a world that would weaponize every clip, every page, every press release, was Harry prepared for the moment? His children looked at his choices and didn't see purpose, only fallout.
Harry didn't answer. His eyes were wet now, not tears. Just the kind of glassiness that comes from realizing you've been defending the wrong hill for years and there's no one left on your side, not even yourself. He said he did it for them. For their future, for their safety, John asked. Then why is the cost still being paid in your name? And that was it. That was the moment it broke. Not Harry, not the set, but the story, the one he'd been telling the world, the one he'd been telling himself, that he was the survivor, the whistleblower, the liberated one. But tonight, under lights that showed everything, he didn't look free, he looked lost. The producers signaled. Time was up. But neither man moved. John finally said, I don't think you're a villain. Harry looked up. Think you're still bleeding? And no one taught you how to stop? There was no applause, no outro music, no light banter to smooth it over. Just 2 men. 1 paper fortress burned to the ground, and all the questions still unanswered. As Harry stood to leave, he looked back once, not at John, not at the audience, at the chair, the one he had walked toward, full of conviction, the one he was now walking away from, stripped bare. Because when you build your life on reclaiming a voice that was silenced, you forget the cost of making the whole world listen. It was never about truth. It was about echo, and tonight, the echo swallowed him whole.